Good morning, everyone. This is Jenny Pakula with OAR, and it's the webinar you've all been waiting for since the end of February, the truth about rent control and Senate Bill 608. And while there's still much room left for interpretation and potential litigation that's going to come out of Senate Bill 608, we will have a great update today from Mike Nuss. Mike is an Oregon native, and he is the co-founder of Rarebird, a collection of boutique real estate companies that include their own portfolio of investment properties, a property management company, a real estate brokerage, and Portland's most collaborative residential investor network. With more than 20 years of appraisal experience, Mike is an expert in finding and predicting future value on properties of all types. As an investor, he has completed over 100 projects in Portland, including small-scale development of single-family and multifamily homes, historic renovation projects, and land development. Mike is actively engaged in Portland's public policy as an appointed member of the Rental Services Commission, Mandatory Relocation Advisory Committee, and the Security Deposit Stakeholder Committee. He also teaches classes on Senate Bill 608 for the Rental Housing Alliance, title companies, and brokerages around Portland. So for all of you veterans, send in your questions and Mike will answer them as they come up. So with only an hour, we got to get moving, and go ahead, Mike, take it away.
Awesome. Okay, so we'll just get right into it today. Oh, can you click on the, okay. All right, so what we're going to talk about, we'll talk about what the rent control bill is. We'll quickly go over that so we can get to the meat and the potatoes, which is really the rent caps and the notices. And I really break 608 down into two components. One's the vacancy control components. That's what I call it. That's the terminations now. So how do you terminate a lease? Can you terminate a lease, and what type of notices do you have to give? For the people that are here locally in the Portland, there's a lot of overlays where Portland and the state contradict each other. So we can field some questions on that. I'm obviously more of an expert on Portland, so we can talk about that question Q&A format. We can talk about how this will affect you as brokers and where are the opportunities. And when it comes to rent control, for me, we can all have negative thoughts about it. I think you can potentially find, depending on what side of the table you're on, pros and cons. But to me, it comes down to opportunities. We can complain and let this slow down our business, or we can focus on the areas where it's creating opportunity and focus on that. I personally have, as an investor on the buying side of real estate, have been rewarded this year being able to buy some really good real estate because of rent control. And then as a property manager, been able to take on grab more market share because of the changes as well. So there are opportunities out there. And then for brokers, I imagine you're all listing a lot more tenant occupied property because of changes like this. So we'll focus on the opportunities, and then the appraiser hat will come on, and we can kind of talk about what does this mean for market value, because that's, it has had an impact on what tenant occupied or income real estate can sell for these days. So we'll get into that stuff as well. So a little bit about me. I was a real estate appraiser. That's how I began my career back in 1997. I bought my first piece of investment real estate back in 2003. I've been giving real estate presentations since 2003 as well. I'm an owner and the property manager for Rarebird Property Management. So I don't run the day-to-day. I oversee the operations of what happens in the property management side. I'm also a broker of Rarebird Real Estate, the brokerage, and their training. So my responsibility there is training brokers. And we talk a lot about rent control in those meetings. And as mentioned, I'm a commissioner on the City of Portland Rental Services Commission. And then the Rarebird Investor Network, that's the education company that my partner and I started that we do a lot of real estate presentations through. So kind of my role at the company is to know what's coming down the pipe, how we can pivot our business models to take advantage of opportunities that come in the market, or how we can change with how political change is happening. So that's kind of my role at the company and why I'm involved. So a quick warning on this presentation. It is a very dry presentation. So the format for this presentation, the reason why I call it The Truth About Rent Control is because it's very difficult to take dozens of pages of legalese and to summarize that in anything that makes sense. And so what I've done is really gone through and actually cut and paste sections of ORS or sections of SB 608 into slides so we can see the actual verbiage. So my idea here is not to summarize, but really to get deep in the actual law and the language. So that way we understand the law and know how to act accordingly with that. So quickly, this is a quick link to Oregon Association. Oh no, it didn't show very well. Oregon Association of Realtor has a good summary on their website. It's one of the better summaries that I've seen. So I wanted to paste that there for you. And then also here is where you can actually go to get the actual copy, the enrolled copy of Senate Bill 608. So if you want to look at the actual entire bill, which is, like I said, dozens of pages, that's where you can find it. So let's get started. So Senate Bill 608 passed the House and the Senate February 26th. Then it was signed into law by the governor on February 28th, and then also took immediate effect. So it went into effect immediately upon passing. And essentially what 608 does is it amends ORS 90. Throughout ORS 90, we're going to see amendments to ORS 90 landlord-tenant law. Today, we're specifically going to talk about ORS 90.427. That's the notices and the termination portion. And then 90.323, that's the rent cap portion. So that's what we'll talk about today, but it does amend other areas of ORS. So we'll start with the rent increase and the cap notices. And you can see on the title slide, this is where you can find that actual verbiage. So this is cut and paste from the bill, section 90.323, and then a new section 3C. And so essentially we have a 12-month period so we can do rent increases over a 12-month period up to 7% plus inflation. And then inflation is described as the consumer price index for all consumers Western region. It's all urban consumers Western region and all items. And it's based on September of the prior calendar year. And so here's some graphs of what that looks like. So this is the Western region dating back from January 2016 to January 2019. So the magenta solid line, that's what we're following. That's all items. And so that's going to be a more volatile change. So we're going to see larger changes in the inflation because we take food and energy out of the equation. Here's another graph of what you can see there. And so essentially you're looking in the 2018 column, September, for that, and then a link to where you can find that graph as well. Most importantly though, for you, don't rely on those graphs. Rely on what the state is supposed to do, which is the Department of Administration needs to publish these maximum annual rent increases on a website. So that website's out now. Here's where you can find that website. And then here's a screenshot of what that is. So right now, 10.3% is what you can see. Now, I don't understand why they're saying 10.3%, because if you looked at the graphs that I showed previously in September of 2018, the change in consumer price index was 3.4. So I've been going off 10.4 myself. Luckily, I'm in Portland, so I don't do rent increases more than 9.9%. But there is a disconnect there, so I always go to where you're not going to get in trouble, right? At the end of the day, we don't want to create case law. So go to the state's website, going back, that's where you can find it. Go to the state's website. At the end of the day, a 0.1% change isn't going to affect your income, but going against the law greatly will affect your income. So go to the state's website to find out what the rent cap is. And now that we're in September, at the end of September, they're going to have to tell us what the rent cap will be for 2020. They're by law, by mandate of 608, it needs to be published by September 30th. But if you go to the actual website for the Western region, they won't even publish the data until October. So not really sure when the state's website will be updated, but they will have to update that and tell us what the rent cap increase is for 2020. So there are 2 rent cap exemptions, and here's the actual verbiage in the law for that. So the first rent cap exemption is for certificate of occupancy within the past 15 years. So new buildings, obviously, new buildings going forward, their certificate of occupancy, say it was yesterday, they're going to have 15 years from yesterday that they can do rent increases without a cap to that. So this is a provision on the supply side. So when we talk about economics and economists, most economists are against rent control. The reason they're against rent control is because what does it do to supply? It de-incentivizes developers to build supply, and then we get a supply and demand out of balance, and that puts upward pressure on rents and prices. So this is the state's way to kind of create an incentive for developers to continue developing apartments. Most developers will either build an apartment building and then sell it within the first year, or they'll hold it for a cycle, but rarely is a developer building to hold for more than 15 years. So this theoretically keeps developers building real estate, and that's the thought process behind it. The second rent cap exemption is if you're providing reduced rent to a tenant as part of a federal, state, or local program or subsidy. So the thought process here is if you're qualifying for a state, local, or a lender type subsidy program, your compliance for that is already significant, and it hinders the operations of managing that type of real estate. So the thought process here is the state doesn't want to make that even more difficult and de-incentivize providers of that type of housing to stop providing that type of housing. So these are the two rent cap exemptions. So they're not exempt from the notices portions. They're not exempt from the termination, but they are exempt from just the rent cap themselves in this format. This is one area where I'm seeing, even in the summaries, where I'm seeing there's a lot of mistruth spoken before the law was published, and then even in the summaries because it's tough to capture. But there is one instance where you have a rent cap in between tenancies. So you can have no rent cap in between tenancies except if you give, and here's the actual verbiage, if you give a 30-day no cause termination within the first year of a month-to-month into the month-to-month occupancy or lease agreement. So in order to be able to give a 30-day no cause termination, it has to be a month-to-month agreement and it has to be in the first year of occupancy. So if anything outside of that, so if a tenant voluntarily leaves, if you do a for-cause eviction and terminate a tenancy that way, any other way a tenancy terminates, you have no rent cap on the next lease up, right? So if you're renting a unit at $1,000 per month, market rent's $2,000 per month, that tenant voluntarily leaves, then you can bring that to market rent up, increase it $1,000 and get the property up to market rent. So that's significant. If we didn't have this, other forms of rent control and other, San Francisco, Washington, D.C., New York, they do have rent cap components in between tenancies. And so not having that is a significant win, I think, for the landlord, the owner side of this equation, because it allows us to get our buildings to market value. At the end of the day, what do you need to maximize value on your properties to be able to have market rents? So this is a significant positive or pro when it comes to Oregon's version of rent control versus other locations in their rent control policy.
So do you think that portion of the statute was implemented to prevent landlords from every year from terminating tenancies just to increase rent?
Well, I think I think the entire bill period was. And then, the idea there, I think, is because when you look at the termination portion of the bill, you can still terminate tenancy within the first year. And so this does, for landlords that just want to make that their business model, that keeps them from making that their business model.
Got it.
Okay, so damages. So if you violate, if you violate the rent cap portion, you're looking at 3 months rent plus actual damages suffered by the tenant. So, if your rent is $2,000 a month, you're looking at $6,000 there plus attorney's fees and then any other true damages. So violating this policy can be extremely costly. So don't create case law, don't violate the policy, and don't get yourself in a position of where you have to defend yourself.
I'm guessing the tenant attorneys are feasting your own provisions, looking
Yeah.
for these kind of things.
Yeah.
It's easy money.
And I have some slides on who benefits from these changes, and attorneys are one. They definitely benefit, and we'll just skip to that right now. The time's opportune. So this, for me, for attorneys, this is the biggest new segment for them to work on since condo conversion litigation, right? So we had a lot of condo litigation when the market crashed and divorces reduced significantly because people couldn't afford divorce. Lawyers then went into condo litigation. So this is the next biggest thing for lawyers, as far as they've got a big caseload coming ahead, because there's a lot of gray area. The way that the verbiage is written, there's a lot of gray area there. And the only way to kind of unshadow those gray areas is for case law. And so that's, lawyers are going to have to get involved. Judges are going to have to make determinations before we have case law that we can actually bank on, as far as what the law actually means in the areas of gray. So we'll get back over the no cause termination area. So no cause terminations are allowed in the first year of occupancy for month-to-month agreement. And you have a 30-day notice requirement for that. So that's actually a change where it went from 60-day notice down to 30-day notice. Tenants can still give 30-day notice, and but now landlords can terminate month-to-month tenancy within 30-day notice within the first year of occupancy. That changes after the second year of occupancy. And then for fixed term tenancies, you can terminate within the first year of occupancy as well. And that's either dictated by 30 days required by law, or what the verbiage is in your lease. So if your lease states that you have to give them 31 days or more, then the lease will override and you've got to go with that greater time period. But kind of the quick takeaway on terminations are, in the first year, you can still terminate tenancy without penalty at the state level. It's when you get into that second year of occupancy, 366 days or more, and that's where things change greatly. So at the second year of occupancy, the only way you can terminate tenancy is if you have a for cause. So either a for tenant cause, and we know what those are: not paying rent, some type of lease violation, which you're then going the for cause route, or if you have an owner qualified reason. So there's now 4 owner qualified reasons to do it's really a no cause termination, because the tenant didn't do anything to cause it, but the landlord has area where they can then terminate lease if they have one of these 4 instances they can use. I call it an exemption further down. So that's called a qualifying landlord reason. That's what the law calls that. And so we'll look at the qualifying reason. So there's 4 qualifying landlord reasons. I call them exemptions to being able to then terminate tenancy.
My question,
Yeah.
and I'm guessing this was back on the second year of occupancy, or could have been the one previous push, and that's within a year after the last tenant moved in.
Yeah, that's exactly correct. And that's some verbiage that is changed in ORS with 608, and that's verbiage that I think actually helps the landlord. So the verbiage now reads that the first year of occupancy is defined by the date the last tenant moved in. So if you had, 4 roommates in a house, 1 moved out, 1 moved in, when that new tenant moved in, and then that's, documented on an addendum to a lease or a new lease, however you memorialize that, that restarts that first year of occupancy. So that is actually a benefit for landlords in this policy. That wasn't clarified previously, but now verbiage has been changed to clarify that. So in my opinion, that's a good tool. We do that quite often. We'll add, remove tenants from leases and add tenants to leases. And so anytime we do that, that's going to reset that occupancy, that first year of occupancy. Are we going to send a handout? I'm more than happy to send this out if you like.
We'll do it after.
Okay.
So thank you for answering the question. I was going to send it privately, but we will, after the webinar, send out these slides to y'all. Okay.
Okay, so the first qualifying landlord reason is if they intend to demolish the unit, the dwelling unit, or convert it to a use other than residential, right? So that could be, well, obviously there's lots of reasons why a landlord would demolish a unit, but so that's a pretty clear-cut qualifying landlord reason. This is one where we have some gray areas. So if the premises is unsafe or unfit for occupancy, where the dwelling unit will become unfit or unsafe for occupancy during the repairs or renovations of the unit. So this is something where something could have just happened. Say there was a fire or a tree fell on the property, you know, that's something that was not planned, then it just becomes unsafe or unfit for housing. Or it could be planned where the property owner then intends to go through and renovate the property. Where I have a problem with this clause is how do you define unsafe or unfit for housing? You know, if you're going to use this clause to terminate a tenancy, and then you go through and you just do paint and carpet, maybe change some fixtures, did the property really become unfit or unsafe for housing? So where is that line? If we pull out the toilets and all the light fixtures, is that unsafe or unfit for housing? If you pull out the cabinets, is that unfit for housing? So what scope of work do you have to have in order to meet the letter of the law, which is really unclear here? So this is one area where I don't want to create case law. There will be people out there creating case law. So this has changed my business practice on the investment side, where I don't plan on, when I'm acquiring a building now, I'm acquiring it based on current rents. And I do not plan on giving any termination notices within the first 2 to 3 years of owning that property, just because I don't want to be creating case law. There will be some where, you know, I buy pretty dilapidated buildings and we do extensive renovations. And in those cases, we're doing plumbing and electrical and opening up walls. And I think that's pretty safe to assume that becomes unsafe or unfit for housing. But, you know, if a unit really just needs some cosmetic makeovers, I personally will not be giving notices for those until we have actual case law established around this. The third qualifying landlord reason is if the landlord's immediate family member, so the landlord or an immediate family member is going to occupy the unit. And the key here is that they don't own a comparable unit in the same building that's available for occupancy at the same as well. So, you know, if you've got a 5-unit building and they're all 2-bedroom, 1-bath units, and you have a vacant unit, you cannot use this clause to terminate the lowest rent tenant in your building. You have to allow the family member to occupy that vacant unit. But if they are all full and you do intend to house yourself or an immediate family occupant, you can then use this clause. And this is a beneficial clause. So, you know, in a real life case study, we had the opportunity to purchase a nice duplex we would love to have owned. But rents were way below market. There was no way we could use a qualifying landlord reason to terminate that tenancy. The purchase would not make sense for us. However, one of our clients was looking for a duplex for the specific reason of housing their daughters. And so that duplex made great sense for them because they had this qualifying landlord reason that they could use. And so their desires and their goals lined up with the law. And so their goals were much different than ours. And so this will keep some investors from buying real estate, but it does provide a bit of an owner occupancy or a family occupancy outside of that.
So just to reiterate, for any of these qualifying landlord reasons, you have to give 90-day notice.
Correct, yeah. And I'll show I have the verbiage for that in the next couple slides as well. So we're not gonna let you break the law on how you give those notices. And there's some specific verbiage and documentation you need in those notices as well.
Okay, so Mike, what if you rent the vacant unit out and then go back and place family member in?
You can do that. So, you know, you can definitely do that. If they're in their first year of occupancy, you can terminate that lease without penalty at the state level. Obviously, if you're in Portland, you're gonna still have to pay relocation for terminating that lease. And then you don't even need to use a qualifying landlord reason to do that. Once they are at date 366 or beyond, then the type of notice will change. So you can move a family member in, you're going to use this for landlord qualifying reason, and then the specific notice will be slightly different than just your typical no-cause termination, right? So if it's their first year of occupancy, you can just, if they're in a lease, you can give them notice that you're not going to extend their lease. If it's month to month, you give them a no-cause termination. it'll just, the notice has changed a little bit to use these qualifying landlord reasons.
So the real magic time period is day 366.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah,
So
day
that's-
366 is a huge ordeal. And before immediately when this came out, we went to 364-day leases. As a property management company, that's what we did, because we didn't want to get in a scenario where, well, what is 365 days, year one or year two? Since then, I've had plenty of attorneys tell me that 365-day leases are fine, because you're giving notices inside of that 365 day, and you're not letting it get to day 366. But that is a significant change now for the law. A nice thing that the state of Oregon does is they define immediate family members. So here's where you can find the definition of immediate family member. The city of Portland does not do as good of a job defining immediate family members. So this is an area where the state, in my opinion, did better than the city of Portland. And then the fourth qualifying landlord reason is if you accepted an offer from an owner occupant. So the way it says is from a person who intends in good faith to occupy the dwelling unit as the person's primary residence. And then it talks a little bit about what you need in that notice. So this is where timelines change significantly when you're selling tenant occupied property if the buyer is getting a federal loan. Because what do federal loans require? Federal loans require that the buyer can occupy the property within 60 days of acquiring the property. But to use a qualifying landlord reason, you have to give them a 90-day notice. So that doesn't match up with federal loan programs. And so if you're intending to sell a tenant occupied property to a buyer, and that buyer needs you to give this qualifying landlord reason during your escrow period, so that way that 90-day notice can be out for 30 days before they close in order to meet the timeline that the federal loan program is going to require. That's going to change due diligence a little bit. It's going to change that escrow period. So for me as a property owner, and so here's a case example of how that plays out. So if I have a property that's occupied by a tenant, say that rent supports maybe $350,000 in value, but I can sell it to an owner occupant for $400,000 or $450,000. There's obviously a lot of financial incentive to sell to that owner occupant. So because of that financial incentive, I would be incentivized to use this qualifying landlord reason to terminate that tenancy and make room for that buyer then to move in with an owner occupied loan. But I also want to protect myself in that scenario. I will want to do some research on who that buyer is, right? So if you're in Portland, you'll know the name Everett Custom Homes. If it's Everett Custom Homes making an offer and they say that they need you to use this clause, there's no way I'm going to use this clause because obviously their business model is not to occupy homes. But if it's Sally and Joe and this is their first property and they're pre-approved for their first home loan, then obviously you can assume they intend in good faith to occupy.
So I'm sorry to interrupt. Have you seen any issues yet with the notice provision on this particular qualifying landlord? Because that for our members selling real estate, this is probably the biggest.
This is where I get the biggest question. So I personally haven't heard of any. Well, no, I have heard of some issues. But this is where I get the biggest questions for sure because it's all about timeline, right? So kind of going back to that case study, as an owner, and I imagine we're going to have a lot of listing agents here that want to, how do I protect the owner and make sure that we get the deal done? Mm-hmm. Well, as an owner, what I'm going to want is I'm going to want them, before I ever give this notice, I'm going to want them to complete all their due diligence, release their inspection contingencies, right, their physical contingencies. I'm also going to want to take that one step further. I'm going to want to have the appraisal done. And I'm going to want that to go through underwriting, and I'm going to want them to remove their financial contingencies as well. The next step, what I'm going to want is I'm going to want them to release earnest money to me. And why will I want earnest money released to me? A couple of reasons. One, I'm going to have to pay out relocation as part of this, right? So you'll see in the further slides, when you give this notice, you have to give them a check for their relocation at time of giving that notice. So removing that tenant does no benefit for me in this transaction. If they fail the transaction, they back out. Now I have a lot of liability on the end, right? So what if the tenant moves out, the property goes back on the market, the tenant sees that the property's back on the market, and then they decide to hire an attorney. They find a pro bono attorney. The attorney says, oh yeah, we can win this case. I'll get you all kinds of money. They may not have a valid reason because I did the steps and they had good faith and the sale failed outside of my control. I still have to represent myself. I still have to hire an attorney to protect myself, and that's going to cost, thousands of dollars potentially.
That's an interesting solution.
Right. So
And that may be a tweak we will take on, the realtors at the legislature, to fix this so our members can conduct sales in a timely manner and not lose VA loans, FHA loans, and so.
yeah, at the state level, what I would push for at the state level for an amendment or a modification of this bill is to, in this scenario, reduce notice to 60 days rather than 90 days. So that way the owner who owns it doesn't have to give that notice, the person that buys it, or they can use immediate occupancy, lower that one to 60 days. So in these two areas, the first two, demolition or unfit for housing, those can stay at 90 days. There's no effect. But the other two, remove those down to 60 days. That'll line up with the sale much better.
Yeah. All right, let's get you a question. I know we got a lot of material. What if their lease ends later than 365 days? They move in October 15th, lease is up the following October 31st of the next year. Since that lease is longer than 365 days, they cannot give a 90-day notice of non-renewal, correct?
Correct, yeah, because their lease already granted them occupancy above 365 days. So that's, one reason why not to sign a lease more than 365 days.
Would it be possible to use this clause upon listing a home and only offering for sale to owner-occupied buyers?
You can't give the notice before you get an offer. So from a listing strategy standpoint, I think the market will kind of wash itself out. Owner occupants will just typically pay more than an investor will pay. But you can't prep for this, right? So you can't just say, oh, well, it's going to be bought by an owner occupant, so we're going to give you notice now to terminate. You actually have to have that offer in hand. And then when we get into the notices that you give, you're going to actually have to send them documentation that shows that you are in escrow. So I would talk to an attorney to state what that documentation requires, but it may be a redacted earnest money agreement or purchase and sale agreement. I forgot what you guys call it these days. Maybe it's just, a statement from escrow that says you are in faith to sell to this owner occupant. Again, lean on an attorney for what they say is qualified documentation, but you are going to have to give documentation. You won't have that documentation until you get an offer. Yeah. So you can't do anything preemptive. It has to be reactionary.
Got it. Let's do another question before we move on. If the sale fails after you've given this reason, then does the 90 days start again after the next offer, or will they still need to vacate?
Yeah, and that's where it's gray area. They may have already vacated and then it's too late. If they're still in the unit, maybe you can talk to them about rescinding it. Maybe you talk to your attorney and what the tenant's paying in rent versus market rent is going to factor into your decision process, right? So if the sale fails and they're at market rent and you want that income stream as an investor, then you're going to want to try and work with them to keep them in the property. Obviously, if they're paying way below market rent, then you're incentivized to not have them in the property. And maybe your attorney is going to recommend that you did all the steps necessary and you gave this notice and the sale failed. And again, I'd lean on the attorney at that. But my inclination is I don't want to get sued. So I kind of try and avoid that scenario. So I'd probably go back to the tenant and talk to them about, hey, this sale failed. I'd at least let the decision be up to them. Me personally, I believe in transparency and being open and honest. And if that sale fails and the tenant's still living there and they have not yet found a place to move, I would probably talk to them about staying.
Yeah. All right. On the payout, the question, isn't that only if they own more than 4 units?
Correct. Yep. And I've got slides to cover that.
Okay. Carry on.
All right. Okay. So,
Do you want to keep this
So the relocations. So if you own not less than 4 units, okay, yeah, so what went back? You clicked on me.
Oh, did I?
Okay,
Sorry.
so in the termination notice, you have to specify the reason of the termination and supporting facts. So that's why I was talking about supporting facts. So, if you're going to use a qualifying landlord reason for demolition, well, then you show them a demolition permit, right? So you have supporting facts, or you show them the application for the demolition report. And then you have to give them 90-day notice. And then at the time the landlord delivers the notice to terminate, they have to pay the tenant an amount equal to 1 month's periodic rent. And so this is where we can talk about Portland and the state differently. So the way Portland's relocation works is Portland's relocation gives you a timeline to pay it by. So if you give a no-cause termination, you just have to pay that 45 days prior to the end of that notice. So if you give a 90-day notice, you have to pay them at day 45. If you so you have a longer time frame with the city of Portland. The state, though, you have to pay it when you give that notice. So essentially, when you're mailing this notice out, you're including a check in with that mail. Or if you're posting it in person, you're bringing a check with you. The city of Portland revised their mandatory relocation policy to line up with this. So how they revised it is your relocation amount at the city level may be reduced by the relocation amount that you pay at the state level as long as payment is made at the same time. So in the city of Portland, say it's a 3-bedroom house and you're looking at a $4,500 relocation fee and monthly rent is $3,000, obviously you don't want to pay $7,500 in relocation. So you're going to send a notice and you're going to send 2 checks, one for $3,000 to meet the state level. That's the 1 month of periodic rent. The second check would be for $1,500 for the city level, and that makes up the difference between the month's rent and the $4,500 that's required at the city level. And then at the city level, you have to give other notices as well, like what are your rights with relocation and whatnot. So you could be sending a pretty large envelope in order to terminate using one of these qualifying landlord reasons. So yeah, so that's kind of a difference between Portland and the state. Okay, and then the relocation fees exemption, so this answers the last question. So they do not apply to a landlord who has ownership interest in 4 or fewer residential units. And so the definition of landlord comes into play here, and this is where you need to know your management company. So if you're using a property manager, they are typically the landlord. And the definition of landlord can be a property manager in the state's eyes. So if your property manager owns 5 units or more, that kind of coincides with this law a little bit. I don't know of any property management companies that specifically own real estate. I know property managers like us, where we own real estate as well, but that's all separate from our property management company. So our property management company owns no real estate, and so we can then be exempt from this, assuming that the owner is exempt as well. And that's kind of the position that we take until we see more case law around it.
What about the LLC? If the owner ships properties into LLCs that he owns, he owns less than 4.
Yeah, and that's where it's gray area.
Shit, so.
Oh, you're fine. The city of Portland went to great regard to name an entity, to really define an entity and, in ownership. So an LLC at the city of Portland level is not going to keep, so say you have 5 different LLCs for 5 different houses. The city of Portland, that's not going to allow you to qualify for this. The state does not have it really well defined, and from what I've seen so far. So I imagine there'll be some amendments made, some technical changes made to clear that up, or case law to establish it later down the road.
Can you ship? Okay.
Yeah. Okay, so terminating tenancy, I think that says for cause. Does that say for cause?
It does.
Okay. So a fixed term tenancy does not become a month-to-month tenancy upon expiration of the fixed term lease, as long as the landlord gives notice in writing for the tenant having. So essentially what Senate Bill 608 created a qualifying reason where a landlord can terminate tenancy if the tenant violates the lease 3 times over a 12-month period of time. And so there's documentation that we have to do in order to do that. So essentially, say you sign a lease with a tenant and in month one they didn't pay rent on time. So they violated the lease, and then you sent them a 72-hour notice. So you sent them an actual notice that they violated their lease and how to fix that. Say in month 3, they violated your smoking policy. You caught them smoking on property, and then you would have to then send them another lease violation notice for violating this portion of the lease. Say at month 6, you find out that they moved in a pet, and you have a no pet policy, you didn't approve the pet, so again, they violated their lease. So that's 3 instances over a 12-month period of time where they violated your lease. Now, assuming that you've documented that correctly, you gave them notice at instance 1, notice at instance 2, notice at instance 3, you do not have to extend their lease. And this could be in their 2nd year of occupancy as well. You do not have to extend their lease when it's up. But you have to give them notice that says that you've committed 3 or more violations of the rental period agreement within the previous 12-month period. I think this goes into the next slide. Can you click on there? And that you've given a written warning notice at the time of each violation, right? So we gave them a 72-hour notice. We gave them a lease violation notice for the lack of paying rent on time. We gave them a lease violation notice for the smoking violation. We gave them a lease violation notice for the pet. And then it has to specify what the violation is, and also has to state that the landlord may choose to terminate the tenancy at the end of the fixed term if there are 3 violations within a 12-month period preceding the end of the fixed term. And you have to give 90 days notice as well. So the violations have to have occurred, at month 9, so that way you have time to then give that notice as well. So this kind of created a 4-cause way to end tenancy without having to evict, right? So an eviction is an actual court process you have to go down to terminate tenancy due to a tenant cause. This is a way to terminate for cause without an eviction. So again, this is good for the landlord side of the equation, where it allows us to have some control over your tenancy as long as you're a good landlord, right? So if they didn't pay rent, you just gave them a phone call. If you saw them smoking, you just gave them a phone call. And if you saw a pet, you just gave them a phone call. Well, you didn't give written warning notice. So you have to be a good landlord. You have to document as necessary and do the right paperwork in order to use this clause, but it gives you the ability to do it. So it's there, that can be used. And then the last thing you have to state in that notice is that correcting the 3rd or subsequent violation is not a defense to termination under the subsection. So you have to state that even though you correct this, right? So when you do a lease violation notice for, say, the pet, you give them a 14-day notice that gives them the right to correct, and you tell them how they can correct this lease violation notice, so that way they don't have to move out. So it's a 14-30 notice. They don't have to move out at day 30. What this says is you now have to tell them that even if you correct this, I do not have to extend your lease, and I may or may not extend your lease. So the verbiage is important that all that's in there. And then you have to specify the ending date for the fixed term, or a date upon not less than 90 days after the delivery of the notice, whichever is later. And then there's again more. So you have to deliver that with or after that 3rd subsequent written warning notice. Okay, so there are also additional exemptions for two-unit owner-occupied termination exemptions. So these are exemptions to the termination portion of the code. They're not exempt from rent caps, right? So even if you are a 2-unit owner and you live in one of those units, you still have rent caps, but you can terminate any time from month to month, whether it's year 1 or year 2, with a 60-day notice. And then with a 30-day notice for a no cause termination exemption. So those those qualifying landlord reasons, those 4 reasons we talked about: demolition, unsafe for housing, moving a family member in, or selling to an owner occupant. Instead of having a 90-day notice, you can go down to 30-day notice for that. And then also for a fixed term lease, they can terminate at the end of a fixed term lease with 30-day notice, or the notice requirement per the lease, whichever is greater. So this is a 2-unit owner occupied property. So that could be a duplex where the owner occupies one side. That could be a house and an ADU, whether the owner occupies the house or the ADU, but it's 2 properties. It could be 2 detached homes on one lot. So 2 properties on one lot, and the owner lives in one of those properties. You have the ability to terminate tenancy no matter if it's year 1 or year 2. Okay, so that's kind of it for the technical side of this. So now we'll kind of get into the other slides about opportunities and what. So what does this mean for you? So opportunities are being created. If you're a listing agent, you should have more listings. Landlords are selling property now faster than historically, especially if you're in the city of Portland, where we have mandatory relocation, and now we have some significant changes on the screening and the security deposit side of the puzzle. But there are opportunities there to gain more market share from a listing agent standpoint. Educated representatives, you can become a true expert, right? And that's how I built my business. I've always given away free education. It's how I built my appraisal business. It's how I built my investment company. It's how I built my property management company and our brokerage as well. We are experts at what we do, investment real estate, and we give out free education on a regular basis. And that builds a business. I think giving out free education, being an expert, being the known go-to person in your industry will build your business faster and longer than any other way out there. So this is an opportunity where there's a lot of uneducated agents out there, and you can separate yourself from the pack by becoming an expert on this. Some real life case examples of this. I think I mentioned one of our clients bought a duplex. They're in the Washington area. They're coming to town. They wanted to look at a handful of properties. So my partner, who's representing them, reached out to talk to the listing agents for these properties. And one of the properties was a duplex, way below market rents. And the listing agent's comments were, "Oh, you can get them out in 30 days. This is after rent control passed. Oh, 30-day notice, you're fine." My partner questioned that, obviously, and they said, "Oh no, 60 days. You're right, it's 60-day notice. They've been there more than a year. You need to give them 60-day notice." So then he questioned that again, and she said, "Oh yeah, you're right. It's City of Portland. You have to give 90-day notice." No, the truth was you can't give them notice at all unless you have a qualifying reason. So if you think of it from a listing agent standpoint, you go to have a listing appointment with a property owner that has tenant occupied property. If you're an expert, whether you go in before or after your competition, if you're an expert, that's going to ring true when you're having that conversation with that property owner. So that's going to allow you to gain more market share and more listings. And I think that's an opportunity that if you know this very, very well, you can work out a niche and carve out a niche working with tenant occupied property. Because it is a lot to know. This is where I get the most questions, follow-up questions from brokers, is on how do we prep a property to sell when you have a tenant in it, and how do we navigate this? So it's a way to get more listings. Diligent management will be more valuable than ever. So if you're a diligent property manager, you have good documented leases, you're consistently doing rent increases, you're keeping your properties up to market rent, that's going to make your property more valuable than ever. If you haven't been keeping up with market rent, and say market rent for your building's $8,000 a month and you're bringing in $4,000 a month, that directly correlates to the value of that property. So diligent management is going to be more valuable than ever. We can talk about who benefits from all this. So brokers benefit, more sellers. So more sellers want to sell, especially the mom and pop landlords. That's where we're seeing activity right now, and so there's market share to grab. And then like we talked about, you can be more valuable as you become an expert. And then lack of knowledge, like that example I showed, lack of knowledge can make you more dangerous than ever. That listing agent example I gave, they're treading quickly to get themselves in a lawsuit. Don't be that person. Don't get in a lawsuit by being uneducated. I think there's significant benefit for property managers on it. Our fees are going to increase. You probably already started seeing that. But we bring on more liability. We bring on more notice requirements. As the layer and layer of legal steps pack on, that's going to be a reason to increase fees, right? So our time's going to increase, our fees going to increase. So I'm already seeing that here in the Portland market, and I expect to see it throughout the state. Market share will increase as well. So mom and pop landlords are being de-incentivized from owning real estate, especially if their rents are 10% or more below market value. They can hire a property manager, raise rents 10%, that pays for that property management fee, and then they no longer have the headache of having to deal with this. So there's going to be more market share for property managers. We talked about that. Diligent management will create more property value. And if you're a investor that owns rental real estate, are you going to want to go with the diligent manager who's going to keep your property value intact, or a non-diligent property manager who won't keep that property value intact? So there'll be benefit there. And so bad management, that's going to kill more value than ever. And we're seeing it. You know, I mentioned early on, my investment company's been able to acquire 5 multifamily properties this year. And in each scenario, that property seller was selling strictly because of new changes in law. Their intent was not to sell, but they just got fed up and ready to sell. And unfortunately for them, they all had way below market rents. You know, they did not manage the property well. And so we were able to get some really good investment acquisitions because of that. So that management matters. Lawyers benefit, we talked about this. They'll be busy creating new case law because of the room for interpretation. And the only way to clarify that interpretation is technical changes to code at the state level. And I imagine lawyers will move faster than politicians. And then case law is the only other way to do that. So we'll see case law established. I see property management suits will increase. I think that actually a friend of mine sold his property management company recently just for this reason. Liability is growing due to more lawsuits, and then broker suits will increase as well. So there's a lot of ways for lawyers to take on new caseload now with this. Tenants benefit, right? So they have little threat of no cause termination after year 2. They're not vulnerable to a radically changing market. When you look at this, why was this policy created? Is because of exasperated market conditions. You know, rents don't go up 10% every year. Rarely do they go up 10% or more. So we have a pretty wide range of rent increases that we can do. But what we've seen in the past 5-7 years, we've had a radically changing market where rents have been going up 15, you know, depending on market segment, 15, even 20%. And so when market rent is increasing that much, but tenants are already below market rent to begin with, that's where those 50% rent increases come into play. And so they're not vulnerable to that anymore because of this policy. Fewer do-it-yourself landlords. I think mom and pop are the backbone of our rental market. It's like a double-edged sword though. Mom and pop landlords are typically the less educated. And that's where a lot of racism comes into play. It's where a lot of bad landlord practices come into play because they don't know the law. So on the positive side for tenants, there will be fewer mom and pop landlords, and so hopefully property management companies will adhere to the law better than some of those do-it-yourself landlords out there. Does anyone lose? Tenants lose, right? So we will see prices going up just from a restriction of supply standpoint. Selling to mom and pop landlords getting out of the business, some of them are excellent. You know, typically something I hear and see in the market a lot on the tenant side is if it's a tenant that has, you know, not great credit, or they have an eviction record, or they have a criminal background, they want the private landlord. They want the mom and pop landlord that will look at them differently than just a check sheet with a box. So tenant, and the more that we lose them from the marketplace, tenants lose. That's a huge loss in the tenants world, in my opinion. I think probably a lot of us share that opinion. So tenants benefit, but tenants also lose. So it's also highly likely that they're going to get rent increases. Even if the market's not going up, they're probably still going to get a rent increase, just because the landlord needs to set precedent and keep up to market. And there's less desire now for landlords to just go longer periods of time without doing rent increases. Owners lose increased operating expenses, right? So if you hire a property manager, you're going to have an increased operating expense. You may be able to eat that with a 10% rent increase, but you're not getting that, the property manager is. So management lawsuits or time, right? So knowing the law, if you're going to self-manage property, it's going to take time to do that. And then obviously you have liability if you don't do it the correct way. And then managers and brokers, right? So managers, we have a much more workload ahead of us, right? I'm consistently going back to this day in, day out, whenever we're giving notices, just to ensure we're giving them the right way. So there's more letter of the law that we have to be to. And then brokers, it's going to be a lot more difficult to sell tenant occupied properties. Just the preparation of it, you can't just give a no cost termination, empty the unit, and make it a really easy sell. You're going to have to navigate 24-hour notice to show. You're going to have to navigate tenants not wanting to show the unit. You're going to have to navigate clutter being around when you show those units. So it's going to be a little bit more difficult to sell real estate. But hopefully you'll have more real estate to sell. And then E&O insurance increasing. So, I just assume we'll start seeing E&O insurance increase because we have more lawsuits at the last Rental Services Commission in Portland. Not due to the rent control policy, but due to the screening criteria changes in the city of Portland. The rumor is 2 of the 4 large airs and emissions providers are pulling out of the Portland market. So if you think of that from a supply and demand standpoint, what are those other 2 carriers going to do that stay in the Portland market? They're going to increase their premiums significantly. I haven't had to renew. I was able to already renew my insurance before screening criteria took place, but I've also heard other managers where their E&O costs in the city of Portland have gone up 50%. So that's significant. As their costs go up, what do? They tend to try and pass that on to consumers, and that leads into what we talked about, fees increasing there as well.
And I know we have a lot of questions.
Yeah, let's go ahead and go to the Q&A.
Do you want to do a few? Yeah. I didn't want to interrupt your program.
No, you're good.
Okay.
We can just go straight to the Q&A.
When defining number of properties owned, is that only Oregon properties owned, or will that take into consideration people who own properties in Oregon and other states?
Yeah, it's just Oregon. So it's just Oregon.
All right. Question, so C does apply per state. I have to refer back to.
So Teresa, I think, are you talking about the title of the slide where I'm showing sections of ORS? I think that's what you mean. Is there's a couple spots where C is in parentheses, and that's right from the code. That's where you find it in code.
Okay. She said ORS 90.427 subsection C. So to C.
Yeah. So essentially it goes 90.427. Then you have 1 ABC, 2 ABC, 3 ABC. So that's what that is it's directing you to the exact portion of the code where you can find it at the title portion of the slides, and then in the body of the slides, that's just cut and paste right from code.
So yes, it does apply to the state.
Yeah.
Giving 1 month rent upon termination. Yeah, I guess that's what she was referring to. Okay. What if the violation is illegal? I'm guessing they're talking about the notices you give the tenant?
Yeah, so if they're if they don't have the right to cure their violation, then you can do an eviction, right? So I think that's the best way to answer that question.
All right, so we got about 3 minutes left.
Yeah, so how will it affect value? So here's the appraiser hat. I picked these 4 photos because it's interesting. They all have similar things: location, market, age, condition, improvements, neighborhood. Not one of these pictures show rent control. But rent control will affect value in the context of that specific property. So there's going to be, I look at it in two things. I look at it on the demand side. So are you going to have increased demand or lower demand? And then that's going to, increased demand will make your value go up. Lower demand will make your value go down. So vacant buildings are going to have increased demand, right? There's no brain damage on below market rents. It's vacant. You can go straight to market. You can put your own tenants in it. There will be increased demand for vacant buildings. Market rate buildings as well. So again, there's no brain damage in figuring out your numbers if they have below market rents. So there's no delayed income stream. So that will increase demand on market rate buildings. And then newer buildings, because they have the rent cap exemption, there will be increased demand for that because the buyers know that they won't have a rent cap that they have to deal with. And then decreased demand. So substantially below market rent buildings. Income properties are tied to their income stream. So how long will it take to get rents up to market? If it's going to take 5 or 6 years to get rents to market, now that the buyer really has to do a discounted cash flow analysis, which it's a big term and it is a big process to figure out, hey, if rents are at market, this building may be worth $800,000, but rents aren't at market, it's going to take 5 years to get there. They're going to do some type of discounted cash flow analysis to come up with a value that's less than 800. In previous markets, buyers are just buying on what it could be, right? So we can get rents to this amount. It can be worth 800. Maybe we'll pay 750. That's a different equation now. And because investors are having to run that equation, demand's pulled back from the marketplace. So in Portland, as of June, I think multifamily sales were down like 60%. And that's just because demand is pulled back as we're trying to figure out how to make offers given the new context of our market. Buildings with physically deferred conditions. So if you're going to have to put significant amount of money into the building, but you can't get rents to market, buyers will be less likely to want to buy that. Tenant occupied single family homes. This is where I think we see the biggest change in value, or at least the difficulty to sell property, is with the single family homes where the tenants occupy them.
So have you seen with any single family homes, the sale price is significantly less because the sellers just want to get out?
Yeah, I see it
Or
all.
offers are coming in less, or it's the whole combination?
Yeah, so if you think of it, say you've got a single family home that's tenant occupied and you can get $100,000 more to sell it to an owner occupant, but you need to sell in 30 days. Unless it's a cash buyer, you don't have that option. And so your option then is to sell to someone who's going to take that tenant who will typically pay less for the property. So it matters in context. Everything in real estate is in context, but yeah, it will definitely affect value.
All right, well, we are out of time, and that was a whole lot of information and still so much to digest, and we'll definitely bring Mike back for another webinar to do where are we now, 6 months later, or even 3 months later. It depends how quickly things are moving with 608. So thank you, Mike, for your time, and thank you, everyone. Have a great day.